When Lori and I were missionaries in Paraguay, we learned that if you go to the hospital, they will not attend you unless you bring your own medical supplies. We learned that the ambulance will not take you to the hospital unless you give gas money. So when we had surgery, we were glad that we didn't have to bring our own doctors. In Mexico, in some public hospitals, you have to bring a certain amount of blood donors if you have surgery. One time a lady from the church needed surgery, so some of us from the youth group volunteered. A relative of her joined us at the hospital. It was a young man, and he was talking aloud about the courage to donate blood. But when the time came, he fainted. He said he was going to donate blood, but when reality came, he just couldn't do it. He was averse to pain and needles. And while most of us are not afraid of needles, we all are afraid of pain and suffering. Peter and the disciples had said so confidently to Jesus that they were willing to die with him, but when reality came, they abandoned him. Granted, it's not the same to be poked and to be killed, but the point is, no one likes suffering. If there would be a line to avoid suffering, I would want to be all the way in the front. I dislike suffering. I'm not good at suffering. But we have a suffering king who has asked people who want to follow him to be willing to suffer, to deny themselves and carry their cross. So today's passage shows us that the disciples are called to be faithful during suffering, and Jesus will give us the example how. We are in Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 1. The Gospel of Mark 15, verse 1, and it reads, "Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. After a mock trial, Jesus was condemned for blasphemy. He said he was the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One, a divine king. Of course, the Sanhedrin, the elders, didn't believe him. What they saw, they rejected. This idea of a suffering king. They expected the Messiah, the King, the Christ, to be a victorious military king, so they condemned Jesus. But they wanted to avoid a revolt, so they could not execute him themselves. They need to keep their hands clean, so they need the Romans to do the dirty job. So they bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate, who questions him. Verse 2, "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priest accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, "Are you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. We know for the details in the other Gospels that this conversation was longer, and that while Jesus said that he was a king, he told Pilate that his kingdom was not of this world. Otherwise, his subjects would have fought to avoid his arrest. He was a king, but not the type of king that the Romans would fear. Therefore, Pilate didn't see a problem. Jesus is a suffering king, a type of king that the Jews rejected and a type of king that the Romans didn't care for. But seeing Jesus being falsely accused, being silent impressed Pilate so much that he was amazed. Verse 6, "Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. a man called Barabbas, was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, so he asked, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" asked Pilate. Knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over him, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. It seems that this suffering king is unable to do anything. He is the victim of superior earthly powers, the Romans and the Jewish leadership. But that is not the case. God is always in control and working his purposes. Jesus will take the place of a man called Barabbas. Many Jewish names begin with Bar because that means son. Abba means father, meaning the son of the Father. This son of the Father, Barabbas, is in rebellion. He has been sentenced to death, but he goes free because the real son of the Father, the innocent, is falsely accused. The unique son of the Father will die in his place, a substitutionary death. The imprisoned one goes free. The one who is guilty of murder is released. God is working through his suffering king. The kingship of Jesus is a suffering and a sacrificial one. And that is Jesus' mission, the will of the Father. The character and love of the suffering king should prompt his disciples to follow him, being willing to suffer, but they have abandoned him. The needle was too big, and they fainted. Since the crowd asked for Barabbas instead of Jesus, Pilate asked, verse 12, "What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Pilate wanted to release Jesus, but the Jews asked for crucifixion. While crucifixion was the normal way that the Romans punished political rebels, it was nonetheless deplored by noble Romans. But what is disconcerting about this request is that it's made by a Jewish crowd. The Jewish hated crucifixion because that it was the way that the Romans humiliated all Jewish rebels. This request exposes the hatred that these people had for Jesus. These people want Jesus mocked and degraded. And that is what Mark is pointing in his gospel. Being mocked is part of the suffering of our King. Verse 16, the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Jesus is brought to a company of soldiers, a cohort, about 600 soldiers. This is not a small crowd. He's pushed around and made fun of. They put a purple robe, and they put a crown of thorns. Purple a tunic only for a king, but in the disrobing of Jesus, he's stripped naked twice. Obviously, a way to shame him. And Hail, King of the Jews, of course, is a parody of Hail Caesar. They struck him on the head and spit on him. This is pure mockery. This is a king who suffers sacrificially. This is a type of king who suffers for his followers and the whole world in self-denial. He doesn't need to go through this, but he knows God's mission. The redemption of the whole world demands it, so he is willing to suffer. And as a suffering king, he has called his disciples to suffer for God's mission and to suffer for him. This is the call for every believer, including you and me. But the 12 have abandoned him. Suffering is a strong deterrent to follow Jesus. Who is willing to go through it? Are you? A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. The disciples Jesus had called to deny themselves and carry the cross abandoned him. So now others have to do their job. The disciples fail to carry the cross. Now Simon unwillingly does it. Next verse, they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, dividing up his clothes. They cast lots to see what each would get. I don't need to talk about the excruciating pain of suffering, the nails, and the scorching that went before it. But suffering is much more than the physical pain, which was terrible. It is the gradation of Jesus. Playing Jesus' clothes was a completely disregard for his person. It's like coming to see a dying relative and start fighting about who's going to get the inheritance as the person takes his last breath. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." The inscription rightly said, "This is the King of the Jews," but the purpose for Pilate to write it was to mock the Jews, and of course their king. Verse 27, they crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days? Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he cannot save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. The crowds hurl insults and mocks and say, "Come down from the cross and we'll believe." They also understood correctly that Jesus had saved others, those who suffer from afflictions, but they refused to believe in Jesus. Jesus could save himself, but he chose to sacrifice himself for many. That is the model that the disciples are to emulate, following Jesus in his suffering mission. Being faithful to Jesus is being faithful to God's mission, bearing up the cruel, despicable ridicule and persecution to do God's will. This is the calling for every disciple. But Jesus' 12 disciples had failed. The ones who were supposed to be with Jesus until the end were nowhere to be found. Two of them, James and John, had boldly declared that they wanted to be at Jesus' right and left. They said that they were willing to take the cup and baptism of suffering. But now, who sent his right and his left? To criminals. Those who said that they would donate blood, they fainted. Those who said that they were willing to suffer, failed. Those who said that they will die with him acted unfaithfully. Others were forced to do what they were supposed to. What will we do when we face suffering for Christ? Will we be in our posts, or God will have to call somebody else to do what we failed to do? Verse 33, at noon darkness came over the whole land until the 3 in the afternoon. And at the 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out loud, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was turned in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. The Jewish leaders want to see Jesus escape death to believe. But this Roman centurion who sees Jesus undergo death believes. This pagan soldier, without Jewish religious understanding of God, believes. In contrast to the inability of the Jewish leaders and even the disciples to recognize who really Jesus is, the unbelief of others is also contrasted. They saw Jesus' miracles, but now they want to see more. They want to see Jesus escape death and descend from the cross to believe. But what the unbeliever cannot see, the believer sees. The unbeliever mocks and scorns and asks for proof. But no matter how much they see, they stayed in unbelief. The unfaithful disciple is unwilling to experience suffering because he cannot see who Jesus really is. He is unwilling to suffer because his lack of faith demands to see more in order to trust. But Jesus calls his disciples to be faithful in suffering. And in our case, God has saved us. God has shown us enough of his grace that he expects us to trust him no matter how dark it gets. And while the earthly powers and the unbelievers mocked and inflict suffering, God is working through his suffering King. God is using those events to bring glory to the Son and to fulfill his plan. Psalm 2 says, the kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. While the earthly powers believe that they can rebel against God and his Christ, God responds in laughter because he is crowning his king. The suffering king is a victorious king. Jesus is crowned by God. Even though he's rejected by men, he is exalted by the Father. He has become the cornerstone. For Christ, the way of glory is through suffering. The road of suffering is Jesus' triumphal procession, as Thomas E. Schmitz points in his work. He explains that there are many similarities between the procession of a Roman military victor and the events of Jesus' procession through the Via Dolorosa. The triumphant march for a victorious Roman general had its commencement at the Praetorium, where they took Jesus. A whole cohort of soldiers was there for the general, as it was with Jesus. Then the general would be clothed in purple. Then the procession would begin. The Roman triumphs were shown as an official bear a double-bladed axe to kill the sacrifice, just as Simon of Cyrene carried the cross. The procession would end in Rome in the Capitoline Hill, which in Latin is the place of the head, just as Jesus ended in the place of the skull. Then wine was offered to the victor, and it was refused and poured on the offering, just as Jesus' refusal of wine vinegar. And there were lictors bearing placards announcing the identity of the peoples conquered by the victor, just as the inscription on Jesus stated his kingship over the Jews. And frequently, at the culmination, the victor was raised above the crowds with two of his generals or vice-regents, just as Jesus was elevated with the criminals above the crowds on those crosses. While it is clear that this was a mockery of Jesus, Jesus' road of suffering is the way of exaltation. As Paul tells us in Philippians, and being found in appearance as men, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledges that Jesus Christ is Lord. The suffering of Christ was his coronation. His coronation was on the cross. But in this life, he died a cruel death. So he calls also his disciples to suffer for him. And the demands to follow Jesus have not changed. All who want to follow Christ needs to deny himself and take up his cross. What does that mean for you and me? The suffering that we are talking about is suffering exclusively for following Christ, suffering for bearing the cross. It is not suffering just because we say that we are Christians, but people don't really like us because we do wrong or we are nosy. That's what Peter says. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or a thief or even any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. We are to suffer for not conforming to the demands of this world. That's what Peter told the congregation. He said that some unbelievers were living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing in detestable idolatry. And the unbelievers were surprised that you do not join them in the reckless wild living, and they heap abuse on you. Suffering for Christ happens when you love people, when you want the best for them, but you don't celebrate their sexual confusion, or their unbiblical identities. And identifying with Christ may cause you friendships, may cause you enmity with family members. It may cause you opportunities. It might destroy your hope for popularity. It may cost you financially. It might cost you your safety. For young people, following Christ may cause you to lose your boyfriend or your girlfriend because you have moral standards, because you are unwilling to compromise your faith. If any of these things happen to you, remember Jesus' words. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world. Paul says that suffering is a privilege. He says, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. So when we are insulted, called names, spit on, figuratively or physically, we should not respond in kind. Many wrong attitudes that as Christians we have are publicly displayed in social media for our own shame. Peter reminds us, Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. That is what witnessing is, giving good testimony while suffering. We are called to be bold as we identify ourselves with Christ, as we testify about his name. Peter says, do not fear their threats, do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. If you do not know Christ this morning, the invitation is just as the centurion. He opened his eyes to see what God was doing in the midst of the chaos of Jesus' crucifixion. And he was able to recognize the Son of God. Ask God to grant you to see. For the rest of us, let's ask God to give us the willingness and the courage to suffer for his name. And for those who are already suffering for identifying with Christ, who are already denying themselves and carrying the cross, may the words of the Apostle Peter encourage you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and the God rest on you. God bless you.